everyone. Welcome back to the What is Money show. Sitting down again today with Mr. Max Hillebrand, and we're going to continue further into Rothbard's book, The Ethics of Liberty. And today, we're going to start with the moral status of relations to the state. And I'm going to read an excerpt here to get us going. Rothbard says, quote, "It means, for example, that no one is morally required to obey the state, except insofar as the state simply affirms the right of just private property against aggression. For as a criminal organization, with all of its income and assets derived from the crime of taxation, the state cannot possess any just property. This means that it cannot be unjust or immoral to fail to pay taxes to the state, to appropriate the property of the state, which is in the hands of aggressors, to refuse to obey state orders, or to break contracts with the state, since it cannot be unjust to break contracts with criminals. Morally, from the point of view of proper political philosophy, quote unquote, stealing from the state, for example, is removing property from criminal hands, is, in a sense, homesteading property, except that instead of homesteading unused land, the person is removing property from the criminal sector of society, a positive good, unquote. So that is quite the indictment against the largest business in the world, statism.
Yeah, it's really solid, right? Rothbard does not pull any punches here. And again, he builds here on all the foundation that we built before, right? And he just stated outright that, well, the state is just a monopolization or institutionalization of crime and aggression, right? Which we've worked on, right? That is the defining characteristic of it. And therefore, it's a special case of human action. Right, we're literally dealing with terrorists and criminals here who steal from people every day as their only way of acquiring capital, right, with literally zero voluntary interaction involved. And that means that any resource that the state commands are not justly his. It cannot be. Just property is defined at that what's voluntarily exchanged or homesteaded, which the state does neither of them. Well, arguably, at least in general. So that means that taking from the state is simply, taking a purse back from the robber who stole it from the old lady, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. And so is, of course, to refuse orders to hand over your property to the state. That is just saying no to a criminal.
Right. Yeah, I have this quote from Nietzsche bouncing around in my mind. He said that everything the state has is stolen. Everything it says is a lie. And I mean, I don't mean to laugh, but it's just so, you feel as if we're almost living in a science fiction novel or movie of some kind when you hear that, because like, how can the dominant institution in the world be the most corrupt enterprise imaginable, to say that everything they have is stolen, everything they say is a lie? And Rothbard goes on to say, quote, "Lying to the state then also becomes a fortiori morally legitimate, just as no one is morally required to answer a robber truthfully when he asks if there are any valuables in one's house, so no one can be morally required to answer truthfully similar questions asked by the state, e.g. when filling out income tax returns," unquote. So in the same vein that he's saying it's morally legitimate to steal from the state, because you're not even stealing technically, I guess you're just you're homesteading, I think was the point he made, that you also, it's morally legitimate to lie to the state, which is to say, not report accurately on your income tax returns. I mean, this is damn near heresy. Rothbard's right.
It is very much. And I wonder how that contrasts here with Jordan Peterson's view of, staunchly always telling the truth. And I wonder what he would say when it comes to talking with criminals, and knowing that a actual theft and harm is going to take place depending on the revelation of the information.
That's a really interesting point, because if you ask Peterson if there's someone breaking into your house and they're asking where a certain valuable is or a certain person is, would you be impelled in that case to speak the truth, knowing that it would bring harm to person or property?
And here again is where we ought to differentiate, right, the morals and the ethics to a sense, right? That you might have that moral to always tell the truth, right, and to try to live by that, which is very difficult. But the question of when do you actually harm someone else, right? The ethical question is much more clear cut, because with most lies there is no violation of scarce property or property in scarce resources, which is the only ethical crime.
Yeah, I'm reminded here that the old adage that all is fair in love and war. I guess the love side is much more complicated in that adage, but in the war side, if someone's aggressing against you, right, to your previous point, there's the yin and yang of non-aggression and self-defense. If someone aggresses against you, then you have the right, if not the impulsion, to defend yourself. So I guess the same would be true about deceit. If someone is aggressing against you or deceiving you, that you would have the right to do it back. I guess deceit's a little bit complicated too, because you might not know in the moment when you're being deceived.
Yeah, that's a very difficult thing, right? And intent is very cumbersome to really find out and to prove. Again, that's where praxeology makes it a lot easier, right? When limiting it on scarce resources, where deceit, where it's obvious when a certain deceit makes harm, as soon as it turns into violation of scarce property.
Yeah. So, all right, one thing that I thought about, and I think I messaged you about this previously, was if we're looking for the persons that have justly acquired, let's just focus on real estate initially, land, right? I feel like if you rewind all of human history, you'll see one violent conquest after another in terms of homesteading land. Homesteading is the wrong word because it's not homesteaded. Conquering land, taking territory. Does that not get you into this regression ad infinitum on who owns the land justly? And that, I mean, I just imagine if you rewind the clock all the way back, you probably have like cavemen fighting over a certain cave, right? And probably one caveman bashed another caveman with a rock and made that his cave. And whoever justly acquired the land, if we've been violently disputing over land across all of human history.
Yes, that's very difficult and very complex and non-trivial to answer with blanket statements. Yeah. This is where local judges and juries come into place to take every case uniquely. And Rothbard has one interesting point in this chapter in the regards of what happens if you know that a certain property was owned by someone and then stolen by the state. So let's say, the microphone of Robert gets stolen by the state, and I now steal it from the state bureaucrats, or take it back rather.
Right.
Then I'm not committing a crime in taking the microphone back from the state, but I'm still not the just owner of the microphone.
Right.
And as soon as Robert comes along and starts to say, hey, this is my microphone and I can prove it, right? That I have this just claim. I still have the receipt and, PGP signed and Bitcoin blockchain or time chain stamped contract and everything. Then I would have to, or you can use force to convince me to give you the property or the good, because you have the just property title in it. But of course, it is often very difficult of who actually owns those goods, because they were often furthered in production stages. And so some people get, the state takes a bunch of iron and out of that builds a bridge, with machines that were stolen too, and with money that was stolen that paid for the labor and such. So who owns the bridge? That is very difficult. And here, then the answer is to treat it as if it were a unclaimed resource. And the first entrepreneur who uses that resource and who advances it in further production stages and who intermingles his labor with that good can claim it his just property, and from there on I'll pursue.
So, oh man, my mind's jumping ahead to the last chapter, but I'll save it for now. It's just so confusing how you untangle all of this, but to your point, where if you can trace the title transfer of property, like as far back as you can trace it, then you have the right, essentially the identified original owner has the right to apply force to reclaim title that was improperly transferred.
Yes.
But the further you go back in that tracing process, the more murky things can become, right? Because not only are you dealing with trade networks, right? Like you said, the bridge, you've got metal that came from here and, paint that came from there. It's just coming from all over the place. But you also have state interference throughout all of these trade networks and logistical processes. So it gets very, very murky. But I guess the Rothbardian counter argument would be, and this was a key point for me, that every time we say the just owner of the property can, take him to court or go to arbitration, I always thought in my mind this is an appeal to a higher authority. But I think the Rothbardian argument is that no, there would be a distributed network of these arbitrators or judges. It's like a free market for arbitration.
Yes, exactly. Exactly because it is so complex, we need to have the free market incentives and failure mechanisms built in, right, as a skin in the game and a properly positive sum game. And as you see, with as long as we have a clear title or a clear history of the changes to property title, then everything is pretty straightforward, right? That's where we see why property rights work, right? And the homesteading principle and voluntary exchange, they work. It's a solid principle. But if we lose the ability to kind of search for and find those title transfers, then yes, then we return into a state of chaos where we no longer know who owns what, right? That's where we fail as humans to peacefully resolve the conflicts of scarce resources. So that's another strategy, right? Is then to build better property rights system transfer systems that are robust and resilient and that cannot be destroyed. Hint, hint, Bitcoin, which is incredibly useful to have a long-lasting and resilient proof of certain ownership titles.
Yeah, and the state right now, it arrogates itself the sole privilege of tracking these ownership titles across time, and this is a real problem in many parts of the world where land registers are, corrupted effectively. They'll just say you think you own a piece of land one day, and then the state updates the list and says, no, you don't. This bureaucrat does instead. So that's tricky. But I guess when it's possible to have property tracing systems independent of the state, because ultimately it's just two parties to every transaction, and they could contract with a third party to arbitrate dispute. It doesn't have to be a top-down monopoly on violence controlling the courts or arbitration. They can just be an independent third party, just like we have. Rothbard makes a point. We have this already in the world. We have independent arbitrators, et cetera, despite the imposition of government court systems.
Yes, exactly, and that's where most of conflicts are resolved. Because it is much more efficient. Right? Again, here, if you want to wait on public court systems owned by and operated by the state, it's going to be extremely expensive, very time-consuming, and the end result is often not going to be just. Rulings of those judges are oftentimes very much not in line with reality and with actual property rights. And that's in part, I believe, because mainly state judges are not at all responsible for their actions. Right. If they have a bad ruling that is obviously wrong, they have no personal responsibility and reliability for this. Right? No recourse to pay damages or somewhat. And in a libertarian society, that would very much be the case. If you as a judge make a bad ruling that leads to some innocent person being violated based on your court, then that is an aggression, right?
They can be sued.
Exactly. It's the same as the police officer kicking in the door of an innocent person, basically.
That's fascinating. That is a totally new way to look at it. Okay. I'll read another excerpt here. Rothbard says, but government has no money of its own, and payment of its debt means that the taxpayers are further coerced into paying bondholders. Such coercion can never be licit from the libertarian point of view. For not only does increased taxation mean increased coercion and aggression against private property, but the seemingly innocent bondholder appears in a very different light when we consider that the purchase of a government bond is simply making an investment in the future loot from the robbery of taxation. As an eager investor in future robbery, then, the bondholder appears in a very different moral light from what is usually assumed, unquote. This one hit me like a ton of bricks too. The risk-free asset in the world is the U.S. Treasury bond. And Rothbard is making the pretty clear point through this lens of libertarianism that they are essentially investing in the future cash flows of this coercive enterprise called the state, or what he says here, loot from future robbery, the future robbery of taxation. So does that mean it is, pretty clear, I think, that it's immoral to even hold government bonds?
Yeah, it is. And the unfortunate thing is that that's, already, like, this is no new fact, I think. Even in established fiat circles, everyone says that the reason why government treasuries is the zero risk asset is because they will always get the taxes, right? Because they have the ultimate force to make that payment happen. So this is, that's the reason why it's the zero risk asset. And that's just morally okay all of a sudden to fund the criminals. And to get the money off the future loot. Right? This is really the disturbing thing. You're literally the capitalist to a mafia organization. You are funding mobsters to violate the property of peaceful individuals on an ongoing basis, and that is truly evil.
Yeah, this is a deep point. There's the old adage: there's only two certainties in life, death and taxes. And I think what's interesting here is that you're actually investing in this constant of human action historically, which is that coercion and violence works, right? That you can put a gun to the head, so to speak, or, put people under a certain compulsory legal framework such that they always pay their taxes, or else, they face the threat of force or jail. And even if they don't pay the taxes, right? Even if everyone rebels and says, we're not going to pay the taxes, they can just print the money in a fiat regime, right? So like the risk of default on a U.S. Treasury bond, for instance, is effectively risk-free if, absent Bitcoin, take Bitcoin out of the picture, because they can just print money or impose the taxes and no one has any other choice. What's your choice? Bury gold in your backyard and try to transact in a very cumbersome analog currency.
And that just adds another layer of evil to the fiat scam, right? You print a whole bunch of money so that everyone is forced to make investments, and then you propose funding the mafia organization as being the lowest risk investment.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, most people will put a portion of their capital, a decent portion of the capital, in a investment where they can get at least some return, but where supposedly they have the least risk, right? To still keep their uncertainty in check. It really is it's a wicked. It's so wicked how the incentives are skewed here for people to have their savings distorted and therefore to run into some form of protection for their capital, and then they run into the arms of funding the mafia.
Yes. Mises makes this argument in Human Action that, and again, this gets back to this universal that I've outlined before, this human proclivity to seek something for nothing. So Mises made the point that entrepreneurs, historically, like people that had accumulated wealth, they wanted to be able to put that wealth somewhere outside of the market, which is to say in a risk minimized asset. And the one that generates the highest return would obviously be favored. And that's how government debt was capitalized, because the government was saying, here's a risk-free return on capital. So it drew in investment, basically. But the deep point here in my mind is, okay, we're right back to the crux of this logic of violence, because now if with Bitcoin in the picture, people do have an option to store their wealth outside of the government system in something that can't be inflated or easily taxed. So there seems to me to be at least the possibility that this constant of compulsion historically could give way to the constancy of something like Bitcoin. It's almost like Bitcoin's the third certainty, as I've kind of joked, but not really joked. It's like death, taxes, 21 million. You now have a third option that's independent of the monopoly on violence and coercion.
Yeah, it's a game changer. It really is. Of course, limited in extent. Right? There's still other property that can be stolen, but monetary property is for sure the kicker. Right? Whichever incentives control that have a massive impact on human action in general. So having a money that is unconfiscatable is for sure a big benefit. But again, we must not stop there. Like, it's really not enough. You need to have private court systems that justly and correctly allocate property rights in dispute resolutions. And you need to have private security agencies to protect and reclaim stolen assets according to a just process, right? All of these things do need to be kind of aligned. Of course, stock markets, right, are essential. And, capital markets, debt markets and such. All of these property rights need to be clearly protected in order to really get to the fullest of what a free market society could accomplish. And that, unfortunately, is way more than just Bitcoin.
Yes, indeed. We were talking a little bit offline before this about the origin of the state, which we'll get into a bit more in a couple of chapters, but I can't help but wonder here if the debasement of money, or we could say fiat currency in the extreme, has been a contributing factor to this. Because had Bitcoin existed historically, I think it just, in my mind, the economics are such that the state would have never grown to the size that it is today. It would have created a lot of decentralizing pressure on states. So we'd probably have, whatever the number is, 200 nation states in the world today. We'd probably have, an order of magnitude more than that. Excuse me. Do you think that's part of this? Is that states were able to just bloat their own bureaucracies through inflation, and that's how they've gotten so far away from their original intent of affirming private property rights?
I think that it was not just inflation, but interventionism in general. It was interventionism in monetary policy, a lot of inflation, of course, the key part, yes. It was a lot of interventionism in schooling. I think that was key. Prussian outcome-based education systems. And of course, agriculture and the misalignments here with grants and massive money flows and sanctions on what to grow. Again, the extent of government meddling in production stages is wicked. So tangling all of that out is a big task.
Hey, everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services, or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin. We'll shift into chapter 25 now, which is on the relations between states. And Rothbard is writing about a situation of violence between Jones and Smith. So he says, quote, "To be more concrete, if Jones finds that his property is being stolen by Smith, Jones has the right to repel him and try to catch him, but Jones has no right to repel him by bombing a building and murdering innocent people, or to catch him by spraying machine gun fire into an innocent crowd. If he does this, he is as much or more a criminal aggressor as Smith is." So I think the general point here he's making is that if you're going to have self-defense, it needs to be directed at the aggressors specifically. Collateral damage in terms of hurting other people, innocent people, is not justified.
Exactly. And force must be targeted against an aggressor in order to be defined as defensive force. And if any type of force is applied against innocent bystanders, then that is aggression against those people. So the quote unquote defender from the first round actually turns into the aggressor. And the same holds true if these two people fighting over property have both men along their side fighting. And so if a small war breaks out among Smith's henchmen and Jones' bodyguard, the same rules apply, right? For every one of these actors, any stray shot that hurts an innocent bystander, or even violates or harms the house, for example, a window breaks, for example, that is a harm done to a scarce resource. So every one of these soldiers are then by themselves responsible for their actions.
That's a good point. I guess this means that a just war, I think he's basically saying that it doesn't really exist in a way. You'll have to remind me here, because war by its very nature is kind of an indiscriminate violence, right? It's indiscriminate affair where and there's sort of rules of war where you're not supposed to bomb civilians and whatnot, but I think he's making the point that something like a nuclear bomb could never be justified because it cannot be specifically targeted against aggressors. It's just an indiscriminate killing device.
Exactly. Right. So if there were a case where, some property was stolen and the victim harnesses a couple soldiers and makes a targeted mission to retrieve his property, and he only harms the property in land and resources and humans from those people that were directly involved with the attack, right? Would that be a war? I don't know, maybe, under some prolonged conditions, but as you say, what we think of war is usually a much more brutal and violent act where a lot of violence is unjust. That's kind of the defining characteristic, I think, of the word. And yes, that is then not really possible, right? If we have this killing spree of also innocent victim, and again, just as soon as one stray bullet hits a window, it's no longer a quote unquote just war.
Right. Yeah. And he's, how does he put it? He goes, so of course the bow and arrow could be used for aggressive purposes, but it could also be pinpointed to use only against aggressors. Nuclear weapons, even conventional aerial bombs, cannot be. These weapons are ipso facto engines of indiscriminate mass destruction. He does say that the only example would be if there were a geographical area where all criminals were inhabiting it at the same time. But that seems pretty unlikely.
Yeah, that's another of these things that, in theory, it's very clear. Right? If there were ever a place where really only convicted and acknowledged criminals are, who all deserve to die, right? Who have all at least taken the life of someone else. No petty bubblegum thieves.
Right.
If we would ever have that scenario, right? Or on the other hand, if there would be a scenario where there's one person standing in the middle of the desert and he's a criminal and a nuke would only destroy him and nothing else, right? And the land where that person stands on is either the land of the criminal or the land of the person or of the victim. So no third party's land gets violated. Then that case would make these weapons still justifiable. But yes, the likelihood of such a scenario is tinily slim. Like that's basically a joke, right? So therefore, these weapons are very likely to be used as war instruments with innocent victims. But again, like the threat must be palpable and actuable and immediate, right? So just having a atomic bomb, I would argue, might not be enough to actually be counted as violence, because just having potential doesn't mean that you're actually going to use it. But still.
Yeah, it seems like, again, things in the event of actual warfare, to try and untangle the property right violations and violence and who was justly aggressed against and who was acting in self-defense. I mean, it just seems like it borders on impossible. But I guess the bigger picture here is that in a world under libertarian philosophy, that you wouldn't really have war in the same duration or scale as we're currently accustomed to it, because again, we're accustomed to wars between states, right? These giant criminal organizations, whereas presumably in a libertarian world, it would just be much smaller, right? They'd be much smaller, localized skirmishes versus something like World War I or World War II.
Yes, and hopefully very accurate guns.
Yeah.
So I mean that's really one benefit for having these drones with guns of high accuracy and mobility, that makes targeted attacks with less casualties possible. Now, of course, the big question is the person who controls that drone. Whom is he targeting? An actual a victim or an aggressor?
Yeah, that's That's a lot to get your head around too, because it seems like, I mean, today the largest states are the ones that have recourse to drone weaponry. It's not like citizens can go buy these things at Ace Hardware or something. Okay, so
also Rothbard makes it this, he continues the thought experiment that because it is so, like, because nukes or these massive weapons of mass destruction are really not usable by any individual for targeted self-defense. Therefore, even in a free society, right, having or a disarmament of nukes and mass destruction weapons would be desired. Which is interesting, right? Because that kind of goes back to your more game theoretical analysis of this, where if a free society would be for disarming all these nukes and for not having them, based on the fact that they are just not ethical to use, that leaves you open for other people having them, and ultimately destroying you. Why you cannot retaliate?
Yeah, I had some conversations recently where, and these are people of more, let's say, a scientific bend, and they're making the point that it's not going to be long before nuclear weapons are developable by individuals. Really, you can just create one in your basement or garage, so to speak. So I wonder what happens then. It's like, how do you say you could 3D print a nuke, something like that? I mean, it's so hard to get my head around the consequences of that, because all it would take is one person that wants to wreak indiscriminate damage, and they just print up a nuke and set it off, right? And then this whole chain of events would then unfold. It's like, okay, all of these people were aggressed against, killed, property was destroyed, etc. There's going to be people seeking retribution for that, but against who? Like, could you even identify the guy that printed the nuke in his garage? Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a bleak chain of events unfolds when I think through that process.
Yeah, that's true. And interestingly, if you don't know the killer, then yes, you cannot apply force against anyone. And if you don't know who actually did it,
Yeah,
that's a very interesting spin on it too. Of course, goes for everything, not just mass destruction weapons. But also, like, I'm guessing it's not too difficult to build an atomic bomb. Or at least most of the knowledge will be out there, and you don't have to discover the knowledge of how to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure if it's easy to get a step-by-step guide, but I'm sure it's somewhere out there on YouTube or in somewhere, of course. It's kind of a miracle that it has not yet happened. And it's not just the atomic bomb, right? There are numerous types of mass destruction ways.
Yes.
Arguably. So let's see how it goes in the future. But what it is interesting is that these levels of mass destructions could really only come up in a system of state monopoly, of violence, right? I would argue that it's interesting because globally speaking, there are numerous states as monopolies of local violence. But on macro scale, they are in an anarchy amongst each other. Right? There's not really one clear controller of the system. And in that state of multiple monopolies still competing at a macro scale, that's kind of where we saw mass destruction weapons evolve.
Right.
So I wonder how that would change in a free market protection system.
Yeah, I mean, I guess presumably, again, we don't know if you have reduced the incentives to violence, which is to say that there's less to be gained from aggressing against someone else, which is something that Bitcoin brings into the picture, that the cost of creating a nuclear weapon and executing a weapon or detonating a weapon, and then the risk associated with that would deter many would-be attackers from going that route. I think to your point is that it was the scale and scope of contention between states, right, that really gave rise to nuclear weapons in the first place, that would not, again, presumably would been less likely to have occurred in a libertarian world of smaller states or governing bodies. I don't know what term we would use here.
Yeah,
but in the transition, it's interesting because like they're already a fact of history now. We have nuclear weapons, and I'm sure the knowledge is out there to some extent. So I wonder what that looks like now, transitioning from a world of statism to libertarianism, how nukes may or may not be used.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that when you localize the monopoly of violence more and more, then mass destruction weapons become less of a useful tool, right? Because the local sheriff is not going to use a nuke to blow up, the gang from downtown.
Yes.
Because he himself would be affected by the blast. So with a nukes in that sense only make sense for interstate warfare, right? Because you can blow them on another country where you're not affected. And it's also if you would have local kind of revolutionaries, it is easy for local force to be pinpointed, right? A sniper rifle somewhere locally, but for these long range kind of affairs, pinpointing targets, especially the state, right, which is this big behemoth or entity, is difficult to do, and ultimately the state claims all the citizens on its local territory and can compel them to join armies and of course tax them. So the citizens of any other state are in times of war always considered as potential threats, and therefore again the incentive to just nuke the territory is much higher in interstate war rather than local state war.
Yeah, the other component here is that in a libertarian world, there would be much more trade occurring. So there'd be much more economic interdependence, which would further reduce the incentive to aggressing against others, right? It would just be more profitable for both sides to have long-term trading relationships versus contentious, aggressive relationships.
Exactly, and nukes will destroy the machinery and the factories of the other guy, and therefore he will no longer be able to produce the things that you would need, and you can no longer acquire them in trade. So yes, absolutely. The more the trade of the market and the production stages interweave, the more taking away part of the other's economy will affect your quote unquote local economy as well. Because it's basically the same thing.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. What's coming to mind here is the William James, the American pragmatist. He wrote about the moral equivalent of war. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. He was basically making the case that he did not believe humanity would ever rid himself of the horrors of warfare until he developed a moral equivalent for it. And his general point was that we have this competitive energy, this animus, this natural proclivity to be contentious with one another. We needed an outlet for that. And historically, war had been the thing. It had been the outlet. It also had been the great unifying force, right? When you actually point people towards a common enemy, it aligns all of your production process, your moral fabric. I mean, moral might be too strong of a word, but people get pointed in one direction is kind of the point. And he was just arguing that until we had a surrogate for war that was morally superior, that we would just always have warfare. And I can't help but think about Bitcoin as a possible candidate for that we at least start competing in terms of Bitcoin mining, right? It becomes this very real competition amongst everyone worldwide to try and really just any excess or stranded energy you have, you can channel that into Bitcoin production. And then by virtue of having people plugged into the Bitcoin network, more property and wealth is being preserved in Bitcoin, which is an inviolable property, more or less. So then that further dissuades the incentives from violence, right? You're reducing the carrot, so to speak, at the end of any coursive chain of events. So then this is just kind of pushing people to direct these animalist or these competitive energies, let's say, towards entrepreneurship and away from statism.
Yeah, one would hope. The question is if that's a true substitute good, right? I'm guessing that killing someone and looting his wealth feels different than trading.
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, we'll see how it plays out. But I think it's going to be, well, again, it's more than just the money, right? You can still steal a lot. It will see there, and that's also, again, the cool thing that the Earth is a huge place, and there will be local areas where physical protection is, for example, much greater, right? And where contracts are actually honored, and where stock markets and trade and such flourish. And those local areas will have even more benefit out of Bitcoin than interventionist marketplaces that just have the Bitcoin kind of as a black market, thing, and with other property rights being violated constantly. And those two economies will still, or the free economy will still outcompete the intervened market economy. And therefore, again, giving more incentives for states to actually open up. Arguably, this was less of an incentive currently with the existing fiat system. I'm guessing. But actually, why not? Why would no state issue a hard money and give out the property rights, even in the past?
Well, yeah, I mean, this kind of gets the sovereign individual thesis of why U.S. state marginalized capitalism outcompeted communism is because communism tried to just command and control the entire economy from the beginning, right? Which did not afford people the private property rights necessary to produce more wealth. Whereas U.S. capitalism or democracy gave people strong property rights early on so they could trade and produce wealth, but only in its later stages has it really started to violate that property. So it was almost like it incorporated more principles of the free market such that it could generate more wealth, and it outcompeted communism. But I guess the reason a government would never just give you sound hard money for good is because they're businesses, right? They're always trying to optimize their revenue. So with the real strategy being that, because, again, in a world where Bitcoin does not exist, is just to let your tax base grow as much as possible before you harvest it. This is like forestry. You're letting the forest grow tall and high quality lumber before you hew it down.
Yes, I think it will be interesting, and of course it will be the counter pressure here is more and more of a global statist interventionist program with collaboration among states and the de facto cartelization of large states to a larger single entity, which of course we see a lot of collaboration among states. Obviously, they all peddle the same religion, so ultimately they support each other, at least in philosophy, and things like the United Nations and such. And I think that will also probably come with more of a because currently we still saw the localized monopolization over the fiat interventionism, while maybe in the future this will also tend to be a single global project where there is really a global digital banked currency or something, to further centralize. It might be a potential outcome, but again, with all types of cartelization, there is a game theoretic Schelling point of defection, and especially with a big and often opportunity cost that Bitcoin is, even for state participants. So it's going to be super interesting to see it play out.
Is that a proper way to look at it then? Is Bitcoin is the most profitable defection strategy there's ever been?
Yeah, I think so. It reduces the cost of defection. I think it does so, at least for individuals.
It even incentivizes defection for states, right? Like, I'm just thinking of El Salvador today. It's like defect from the IMF World Bank cartel and just grab Bitcoin in anticipation of future adoption.
Yes, but the problem is that if you would fund the state solely from a Bitcoin hoard, right, you're going to have problems. So sooner or later, you do need to, tax, of course, but then also probably what you want to do is, as a state, is to go into debt. Yes. And here is where the International Monetary Fund has very much power and can censor states from accessing capital liquidities. And that's one of the things where we're very much not ready for a Bitcoin denominated credit market, very nascent industry, and that needs to develop and flourish much, much, much more. But currently there's just no such option, right? So I wonder how a bold move like in El Salvador will play out.
Yeah, I hear it's going to be like long run dampening to their revenue model of taxation and inflation, but I'm just thinking short run, it provides a nation state like El Salvador, which is very low in the geopolitical hierarchy, an opportunity to springboard itself, frankly. It's the same game theory that plays out at every level. It's like, once you've figured out the reality of hard money and Gresham's law, and if you move first, you benefit disproportionately at the expense of later adopters, right? People that figure it out later, or people, institutions, or nations that figure it out later. So Bitcoin's kind of incentivizing defection by even nation states from this established geopolitical order.
Yes, I would say so. But yeah, I mean, I think it's, similar as we saw with places like Liechtenstein or Luxembourg or Ireland, where a large degree of freedom and property right protections were established, and these places flourished in capital accumulation to the local area, ultimately, even benefiting the local bureaucrats and state agents. I think that it's going to be the same but bigger, especially because this is now truly native in cyberspace. So if there were a local area to define and establish and protect property rights adequately, and make it possible for foreigners to create legal entities in that area, then that's going to be a great driver of moving capital towards there, right? I'm thinking like a Wyoming company that is trivial to set up, or other places. I think this, with this happening, and with Bitcoin making these sorts of strategies infinitely cheaper, and it's like foreign offshore companies and stuff like this were always possible, just ridiculously expensive. And with Bitcoin, it becomes a lot cheaper, and not just for individuals, of course, but also for groups of individuals, including states.
Yeah, it's very interesting because there's that incentive for defection, but it's kind of like taking a poison pill for the state in a way. It's like they might, El Salvador could accumulate some Bitcoin now, enrich their treasury, probably even grow the net worth of their nation as Bitcoin monetizes, right? I think they have 700 Bitcoin in their national treasury, something like that. Bitcoin continues its path toward global monetization over the next 10 or 15 years. The net worth, I don't know if that's the right term to use for a nation state, of El Salvador is going to be much higher as a result of that. But their long-term revenue prospects in terms of inflation and taxation are diminished as Bitcoin succeeds. So there's this like Trojan horse element to it, where you have an incentive to adopt early, but it's also net destructive to your business model.
And interestingly, also to the war machinery, right? The more the Bitcoin standard evolves, the more difficult it's going to be to print fiat money to fund atomic bombs and weapons of mass destruction. So to tie this back to earlier, right? I think that with a greater proliferation of Bitcoin, that weapons of mass destruction are going to be less of an issue, or at least they will be less produced, arguably. Maybe they're going to be produced much more efficiently if they're still valuable enough.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to read an excerpt now. Rothbard describes different types of violence. He says, quote, since each state arrogates to itself a monopoly of violence over a territorial area, so long as its depredations and extortions go unresisted, there is said to be peace within the area, since the only violence is continuing in one way, directed by the state downward against its people. Open conflict within the area only breaks out in the case of revolutions, in which people resist the use of state power against them. Both the quiet case of the state unresisted and the case of open revolution may be termed vertical violence, violence of the state against its public, or vice versa. And he contrasts that against horizontal violence, which he describes as, quote, except for revolutions which occur only sporadically, the open violence and two-sided conflict in the world takes place between two or more states, i.e., what is called international war or horizontal violence. So it's just distinguishing here between, state clearly is perpetrating violence or aggression against the property of its citizens through taxation and inflation, all the reasons we've laid out here, conscription as well, which he terms vertical violence, or the reverse, which is people overthrowing the state or attempting to overthrow the state in a revolution. That's vertical violence, whereas horizontal violence is this geopolitical anarchy you've described of contentions between states.
And it's interesting that we had a lot of or many small kind of localized horizontal wars, of some invasions into the Middle East, of course, the world wars and such. But especially in the last 2 years, vertical violence is actually the most common and proliferated worldwide, right? Especially lockdowns and all types of medical mandates are a clear aspect of that. So even though we might not have a world war in the sense of horizontal violence, we do very much have it in terms of vertical.
Yes, especially since COVID, it's vertical violence in the direction of state down onto citizens has been escalated in a way we haven't seen in a long, long time, right? This includes fiat currency inflation. 40% of the dollars in existence are produced in the past 18 months. Clearly, the specter of vaccine mandates, and indeed, at least in the US, I think Biden's pushing that through on federal employees. They've been putting a lot of pressure on employers, on private employers as well. There's also, in the US, we've hired like 80,000 IRS agents. So they're becoming much more aggressive in tax enforcement. So, this is I think it's important here that we view the state as antithetical to entrepreneurship. And this is a point I believe Mises made. I believe I got this from Mises in Human Action, where he's like, entrepreneurs and the free market is creating wealth by making, essentially, making and trading. The state is the exact opposite force of that. It's taking from trading and taking directly. And it appears to me that these depredations of the state have just been escalated. The why, to me, it seems, my admittedly biased view is that Bitcoin is really shaking the foundations of the state. And I think they're starting to wake up to this existential threat. You could say maybe Bitcoin and digital technology more generally, like a lot of power has shifted out of Washington, D.C. into Silicon Valley, for instance, even before Bitcoin. So there's this transformation going on, which I think is us moving from the industrial to the digital age. And I think the state now is starting to take this seriously, starting to fight for its survival.
Yes, and I think we, as you say, right, this is not just Bitcoin. I think we see this in personal transportation, right, with just vehicles and cars, incredibly liberation technologies, motorbikes, insane. To have something that cheap and that small to deliver you around quickly and fastly and securely is an absolute miracle. So there are numerous technologies, of course, the internet, and personal computing, just that they have a smartphone in everyone's pocket is again, crazy. So all of these technologies have the potential to be used in a self-sovereign way. And the kind of technology to actually use gets better and better with time, meaning more secure, more user-friendly. So as time increases, I see that more and more people are using these technologies, meaning having actuable defense against the state and against coercion that is unbreakable. And again, with the advantage of free software, right, that you can build this and ship it out to 8 billion people and update it overnight for everyone. Right? All of these craziness that is free software development being applied to the defense of property, that is free speech and free money, is a massive impact.
Is the contention here then we have technological innovation empowering individuals more and more, right? The internet, the motorbikes, to your point, smartphones, technology keeps giving people more economic independence or power at the individual level, which is an increase to total productivity. But the state keeps trying to harvest that productivity via inflation and taxation. So that seems to me to be this fundamental contention. And that's how I'm framing up the antagonism between entrepreneurship and statism. Is that, technology keeps it, but in the long run, if you look over the longest scope of history, it's a decidedly one-sided fight, right? Like power keeps decentralizing. We've moved from the ancient tyranny of Egypt, for instance, where there's just a pharaoh or a couple of pharaohs that are fully sovereign, everyone else is effectively a slave, to today, even though citizens in the Western world, we have all of these aggressions we suffer against our property and person from the state, it's still way better than it was 5,000 years ago, for instance. So is that the primary contention here? Because I've been thinking, Peterson talks a lot about power, and I think his interpretation of it is always the arbitrary power of one group, of one configuration of willpower over another, or one individual over another, one group over another. But what seems to be driving it mostly is the economic power enabled by technology, right? Which enables you to either be more powerful individually or resist the impositions of others.
Yes, and it can go both ways though too, right? This technology is very powerful also to be used against you. Especially if either the good tools are misconfigured or if the tools are deliberately built in a bad and malicious way. Right? Malware, obviously, right? Or all types of and again here, right? Difference between ethics and morality, right? Most software applications don't actually steal property from you, but they're highly addictive and foster certain undesired behavior. Whatever that is, more on the moral layer. And here again, this is a massive experiment. If you give a lot of choice of which tools to use to everyone, what will play out? And will people even want that choice, or will we go more into this kind of WeChat experience where there's just one provider for everything in one application? Or is it going to be, the crazy Linux world where you install just whatever application, on whatever operating system and such? I don't know. Again, ultimately it's about preferences, and oftentimes centralized solutions are just so much easier to build and are therefore much more widely used. But I do believe that many of the people working on this tech do want to have it secure and resilient and with user sovereignty. That might just be my local bubble where I'm at. It's probably a tiny majority of total developers, but it's ultimately I think the best tool will kind of win out in the long run, at least.
Yeah. I guess to finish framing my point on power, and I should have said this earlier, is that I think about it more in the fundamental physics definition of work over time. The state needs to increase its revenue. It wants the market to produce more power, actually, but it wants to do it in a way that it can harvest that power through asymmetric wealth transfers. But the market clearly wants to be able to produce more power, to do more work over time, but then store the fruits of that labor in something that can't be aggressed against. So, this gets back to that book, Lessons of History by Will and Ariel Durant, the 100-page book about all of world history. And it talks about this back and forth between centralization and decentralization, calling it like the heartbeat of history. So maybe, I don't know, maybe that's what's going on here, is just you have the theft of the state or even others sort of driving this standardization or patterning of technology and systems into something that's resistant to theft over time. And then the market sort of decentralizing that power, but then the state trying to, as more power is produced, the state has a greater incentive to try and harvest it. So,
and your earlier thoughts here are pretty, Randian from Atlas Shrugged, right? As John Galt says, he's to stop the engine of the world, meaning to withdraw his productive capability as an entrepreneur and to no longer make it available for state intervention and for state confiscation, right? He escapes into his John's Gulch, right? To apply his work there and to keep his fruits of the labor and to not be subject to theft. And he only comes back into the fiat world and provides meaningless tasks that are way below his capability. Right? That's the thing. The state is a parasite. It needs to eat of something. And if the host withdraws or removes himself or diminishes its own existence to the parasite, then the parasite has nothing left but just to die. And that's what we saw, I believe, at the collapse of the Soviet Union or other communist experiments. And that it just, all productive people left, and the rest of the crew is just misfits who don't really know how to solve a problem.
Yeah.
Here again, if that opting out and withdrawing your capability, shutting down that engine of the world, if that becomes easier, and especially if you can protect your capital, of course, and your savings, and if that is easier and cheaper, then more and more productive people will stop their engine, and the parasite will have less and less to feed upon.
That's a good way to think about it. This ratio of parasiticism, if that's a word, to production. If it gets too high, then the host dies. And when the host dies, the parasite dies. And really, I mean, that's a nice framing for the importance of Bitcoin too, is that it's just reducing the attack surface of the host to the parasite. Almost, I mean, I guess to your point earlier, not completely, because there's other forms of property, but at least in the sphere of money, in theory, it would be complete. It's like you can't steal or inflate anymore. So Rothbard says, quote, finally, we must allude to the domestic tyranny that is the inevitable accompaniment of interstate war, a tyranny that usually lingers long after the war is over. Randolph Bourne realized that, quote, war is the health of the state. It is in war that the state really comes into its own being, swelling in power, in number, in pride, in absolute dominion over the economy and the society. The root myth that enables the state to wax fat off war is the canard that war is a defense by the state of its subjects. The facts are precisely the reverse. For if war is the health of the state, it is also its greatest danger. A state can only die by defeat in war or by revolution. In war, therefore, the state frantically mobilizes the people to fight for it against another state, under the pretext that it is fighting for them. Society becomes militarized and statized, and it becomes a herd, seeking to kill its alleged enemies, rooting out and suppressing all dissent from the official war effort, happily betraying truth for the supposed public interest. Society becomes an armed camp with the values and the morale, as Albert J. Nock once phrased it, of an army on the march, unquote. So, I mean, that's a scary way to put it. War is the health of the state. So if we're going to live in a world where statism is dominant, we should expect continuous warfare, because that is what energizes the coherence and purpose of the state to a large extent.
Exactly, right. The state is defined as having the monopoly privilege of or justification to use aggression. So yeah, if you give someone the kind of blank slate of just, okay, it's all right if you steal and kill, just do as you want, basically. Well, obviously he's going to do it, and that leads to war, either between state and citizens, or of course in between states. I think. I mean, the state, I think, especially kind of comes into its full power when the subjects are full of fear, more generally. And Rothbard points out that war is one commonly feared thing, right? The enemy army invading the local territory, right? And the state then proclaiming himself as that hero to defend those innocent citizens from the foreign invader. But during times of that type of invasion, of course, we saw price controls, prescription, and all types of interventionism. But the same is seen with, or for example, could be seen if, let's say, a meteor comes along there might again be a lot of interventionism being done. Or, of course, with a pandemic, a virus, as we've seen, the amount of interventionism has been breathtaking just for the fear of a virus compared to the fear for war.
Yeah, I'm reminded here of the Clausewitz quote that war is the continuation of politics by other means. So if war is the health of the state, then that means state enterprise is going to be constantly at war, which we see right in the world today. Is there's a superpower that's effectively an imperialist. They're at war. The US is at war all over the world all the time, right? It's big business. And then this feeds back, I think, into culture, and that now politics becomes such an important aspect of life, right? Like politics is the decision-making apparatus that controls this war machine. And that causes people to overemphasize the political aspect of their identity at both the individual and the group level, right? And we see in the US, it's a mass psychosis, as I've argued in some of my writing. I think this is, which is sort of touched on in the Sovereign Individual. It's like this idea that politics, what side of the aisle you are on is a prime determinant of your identity, is a modern psychosis. And it's largely based on the violability of property, right? The fact that the state can go to war and generate revenues from that is what feeds this delusion of politics being so important. Whereas, and the thought experiment I have in my mind here is, if property were not violable at all, if you could say that everyone was invincible and you couldn't steal through theft, like no one would care about the opinions of others. We wouldn't be so, oh, you got to be a liberal or you've got to be a conservative. We wouldn't have the incentive in place to have so much concern for the opinions of one another. If we had differing opinions, we'd just go separate ways. But the fact that the reverse is true and that property is very violable, and territories can be conquered, people can be aggressed against, currencies can be inflated, it just pushes the world into this mass psychosis of politics, imperialism, and warfare.
Yes, and this kind of this difference between left and right politics really is nonsense. It's kind of the difference between, well, in a sense, left socialism versus right socialism. It's all just different flavors of interventionism. There cannot be a political party that truly advocates for property rights by the fact that political parties steal and therefore violate property rights. So it really seems to tend towards one direction. As Mises would say, the middle of the road leads to socialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this I love how Rothbard gathers all of these ideologies which we are accustomed to believing are different, like capitalism, socialism, fascism. He's gathering them all under the rubric of statism, right? Even capitalism, which I know capitalism actually means non-statism or low, minimized to no government, but it's been destroyed. That term has been destroyed in the 20th century because now we associate US capitalism with capitalism, and it's not at all capitalism. If you have a central bank, you're not a capitalist society.
Basically, yes. But it's always a bit weird to make that argument because it's the same as last time wasn't the real socialism, and this time it's going to be different, and so it always feels similar when we're making that argument of this what we have right now isn't the real capitalism. It's going to be very different in the future. But at least in theory, that's the case. That might be because these pure theory kind of utopias are maybe impossible to achieve. Maybe on the full side communism, and on the other extreme pure free market anarchy. Maybe that's maybe it's too extreme or too philosophically kind of pure to be the right resolution in action. We will see, but
the sense that I get, at least, I mean, the benefit that I get from Rothbard's framing is that he's gathering all of these assumably conflictual ideologies under statism, right? Then that's packaging it more accurately, because it's the state that is the aggressor against property and person, that, war is the health of the state. And it doesn't matter what ism you put on the end of it, it's all under statism. So it gives us something to work against. It's like all flavors of statism are something we should move away from. But I agree, it does maybe get a little murky, because then it opens up this attack vector, if you will, this ideological attack vector of, oh, well, yeah, we don't want state capitalism. We want pure capitalism, which we actually do want pure capitalism. But I guess my point here is that the terminology gets so murky and confused, because then people will say, oh, you need pure communism. But communism is not even possible without a state, because you're saying that we're not going to have private property rights. We're going to have all of the property doled out according to the whim of some authority, right? So you can't have communism or socialism without the state, because there's no private property rights. If there's no private property rights, there's no civilization, right? So I mean, I'm advocating for the term sovereignism, which is like Bitcoin-enabled anarcho-capitalism. But I think that it's very healthy for the world to start thinking in terms of statism and non-statism, whatever you want to call that, versus these endless debates between, well, should the government be capitalist, or should it be communist, or should it be fascist? I think all of those arguments just fail. They're just hacking at the leaves. They fail to get to the root of the problem, which is the state itself.
Exactly. Did you steal from someone? That's it. If you did, that's bad. If you didn't, do what you will. It's as simple as that for individuals, and it is as simple for that on thinking on macro levels, like states or collective actions.
We have so far to go, though. I mean, people still don't know inflation is theft. They don't understand taxation is theft. They don't understand conscription is slavery. But when you look at these matters through the Rothbardian lens, it doesn't seem like there's much of an argument to me.
Yeah, that's very true. That's interesting, because it was with this rationale, it was always obvious that slavery was a bad thing, right? So why didn't the people wake up and just abolish slavery? Because it was bad. And I guess, well, the mainstream depiction of the history is that, well, Lincoln outlawed slavery and therefore everyone just gave it up, right? So a state resolution to the problem, which is obviously not what happened. The fact is that using human slaves was way less productive than using more advanced toolery and machinery and roundabout production stages and voluntary consent of workers. So it was an economical argument that made it unprofitable to keep slaves. And as the productivity per person kind of increased, that was less of a justifiable cost, and therefore more and more entrepreneurs who were profit-seeking could not carry it, and therefore abandoned the practice. And arguably, right, if we increase the productivity of individuals with further advanced capital tools, machinery, software, technology, and other types, and we increase their protective defenses, via sound money and such, that is kind of a two-way swing of stealing less productive, less profitable, right? More expensive and less revenue-seeking. And that is kind of the next step in abolishing slavery, and is just to make it even more costly for states to intervene.
Yeah. Increasing the cost of violating property, right? That's like if there's
that's the number go up technology.
Yeah, that's the metric, right? That's the metric. I guess we should be optimizing for in many ways, right? It's like, how hard is this thing to hack or violate, whether it's, a monetary technology like Bitcoin, or maybe like a socioeconomic or arbitration or court system, right? Like, how resistant is it to corruption or asymmetric attack? It seems like there's some, and maybe it is just that simple. It's like cost to violate property. If we can increase that, you can decrease the need to trust individuals, right? You're trust minimizing the socioeconomic fabric, which is something that, money is intended to do. But I think social institutions more generally really are intended to do, right?
Yes, and to distribute the risk, right? So that there's no longer one central point of failure, but that the risk is distributed to multiple actors, and that many of them need to be compromised before the system ceases to function. That's another thing that is just so cool with Bitcoin. I mean, of course, Bitcoin uses that in its own security principle, but also Bitcoin allows second layer kind of security models to be built on top of that, right? Like multi-signature schemes. Where the risk of holding or being responsible for spending that Bitcoin is distributed to numerous actors. That's such a powerful tool. It truly is. And it goes exponentially. It gets leveraged with better underlying technology. If we have strong private-public cryptography and such, for example, that's already great. If every single actor has that. But then if multiple actors can come together to combine their own unique private-public key power in this threshold or federation principle, right, then the better the underlying crypto is, the better it's going to be if you federate it, roughly speaking. And that just, shows how layering these defensive technologies has a larger and larger and larger impact. And Bitcoin is just yet another wave of layering these fundamental principles, and the outcome is crazy. And what we can do in the next step, by leveraging Bitcoin and building other systems on top of that is just extraordinary.
Yeah, there seems to be this, and this is kind of how slavery was naturally disincentivized through free market action, is it as we accumulate more capital, the whole market structure is shifting from labor intensity to capital intensity. So what I mean by that is, at the dawn of the agricultural age, 100% of the workforce is engaged in agricultural production, right? Just to feed itself effectively. Fast forward to today, less than 5% of the global workforce is engaged in agricultural production to feed the rest of us because of capital, right? We've accumulated capital that's magnified the returns on labor. And so at some point with slavery, it seems like in my mind that the contribution margin of each unit of slave labor just became less than the cost of enforcing the slavery itself, such that as the market naturally progressed to being more capital intensive, there was less dependence on labor. So therefore, slavery just dissolved as an institution. I wonder if perhaps we're seeing something similar maybe in the digital age, that we're once again just increasing free exchange so rapidly, and capital is magnifying labor in a different way, that we're kind of thrown off the yoke of modern slavery, which is statism.
Yeah, indeed. And hopefully in hindsight, a couple 100 years, we will look back in horror of the crazy schemes that we came up with during the last century. And then realize that, thank God for Bitcoin that came around and helped tip the scale.